Rail and tram friends, welcome to another appointment to our cycle of international conferences. Tonight, we have the second part of a presentation about the Upper Silesian tramway system by Michael Russell. We already saw the first part some months ago, and I'm sure that the second part will be interesting as the first one has been, naturally. The presentation will be done in English, but you can also use the chat in every moment during the presentation in English or in Italian. At the end of the evening, there will be some space for dedicated to some any questions if you like to ask some. I tell you that the next presentation is scheduled for the Tuesday, the 2nd of December, and that presentation will come from Australia, exactly from Tasmania, and will be titled "The Tramways of Tasmania." So 2 December 2. Thank you. Before giving the floor to Michael, I have to repeat everything in Italian. Buonasera a tutti, benvenuti a una nuova serata del nostro ciclo di presentazioni internazionali dedicate ai tram e agli altri mezzi di trasporto. Questa sera abbiamo la seconda parte della presentazione di Michael Russell sui tram dell'Alta Slesia. Qualche mese fa era stata fatta la prima parte, sono sicuro che anche la seconda sarà interessante come è stata la prima. Sarà in inglese questa presentazione, potete usare la chat in italiano quando volete durante la presentazione, infine ci sarà spazio per eventuali domande di approfondimento. Vi annuncio che la prossima presentazione è prevista tra 2 settimane, quindi martedì 2 dicembre alla stessa ora, e sarà dedicata ai tram della Tasmania, quindi dall'Australia. Grazie, e ora do la parola a Michael. Michael, I'm giving the floor to you. Just a moment that I have to share my screen to see your presentation.
Right.
Let's
well,
go.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Now, some of you were present when I gave the first part of this talk some months ago. Others of you were not. But even if you were present, you've probably forgotten a lot of it by now. So just so that you're not dropped completely in at the deep end, I've decided that for the first 5 minutes or so, I'll give you a very brief recapitulation of the wartime period so that we can then proceed to the post-war period and the developments today. Here we see a map of the Upper Silesian tramways as they were in March 1936, at which time, of course, the area was still partitioned between Germany and the newly constituted Poland. The red lines indicate the company tramways still in German ownership. The blue lines are the former company tramways, which had been transferred to Polish ownership after 1919. In the top left, the green lines show the municipal tram lines of Beuthen. That's what we call Bitton today. It was Beuthen in those days. And to the top right, in brown, are the lines developed from 1928 onwards in the coalfield, and commonly referred to even today as the coalfield tramway. The solid lines are the standard gauge lines that have been converted, and the broken lines indicate those still operating on 785mm gauge, the narrow gauge, which dates right back to 1894. Next. During the period of the late 1930s and 1940, rolling stock that had been built on for narrow gauge operation was converted to standard gauge. Here's an example of one such car at one of the terminal points in Gleiwitz, and there were about 10 of these on routes that had been converted to standard gauge by the German companies. Next. During the early part of the war, from 1939, 1940, there were various changes to the tramway operation. Here you see one of the pre-war cars, two-axle car that is displaying German insignia with the Hakenkreuz. And once Germany had invaded Poland in September 1939, all the pre-war restrictions on operation were removed. You'll recall perhaps that a whole series of 7 boundary points had been created between Germany and Poland from 1922 onwards. These were lifted immediately. Through services were reinstated where that was possible, though that wasn't possible in every case, and new through services were also introduced. So there was quite a change. The actual operating companies remained the same, at least at this stage. The 2 German companies were allowed to continue more or less as they had been doing between the wars. The Polish undertaking was merged with the German operationally. And of course, as with everything else in the area, all the place names were Germanified or Germanized. Those that had been Germany before 1919 reverted to their old names. And in the coalfield, which had never been part of Germany, they had German names applied for the first time. Next, please. Here's a view in Katowice of one of the German bogie cars working on a local service, what was known as the 16, which had been opened in 1912. Next. And in the Polish partition, as was, this is the scene in Königshütte, which had become Horzów, with a train of rolling stock on the narrow gauge line, taking layover time in the center of Horzów. Still a lot of narrow gauge in operation in the former Polish partition at this stage. Next. This is a view on line 9, the famous line 9, still runs today, though you wouldn't be able to take that view today. The buildings are still there, but greatly hidden by foliage. And line 9 was for a long time a very difficult line to work. It was in any event a difficult line to work, but it had to be operated in 3 sections. The 2 outer ends had been relayed in standard gauge, but the work was never completed before the war broke out. And in the middle, the very heavily industrialised section, was a remaining narrow gauge link of probably about, I don't know, about 4 miles. So through passengers had to change probably twice. Next, please. Here's a map of the situation in 1942. I've chosen this date because this was when the interwar, the wartime regauging program continued. Now, you might find it quite amazing that the occupier found the money and the resources to relay extensively tram track in the early years of the war. But the thing was that transport in the whole industrialized region was very difficult. The mainline railways, such as they were reserved for German troops. The motorbus services, which had been introduced in the interwar years, had been thinned out to save fuel and rubber, and the trams were placed under extremely heavy duress, really. And in fact, the management later in the war said that they believed that their traffic had risen threefold, that the trams were being asked to carry 3 times as many passengers as they had been built for. And one of the big problems for the occupier was in getting staff to work because we'd still got this mix of gauges. And you can see in the blue that there's still quite a bit of broken line. And the line 9 that I mentioned just now is the one on the left of the blue section. It's probably somewhere around 4 miles. So in 1940, it was decided to start the relay of the remaining sections of narrow gauge tramway in the Polish partition. And the first section to be dealt with was that between Katowice and Königshütte, the line 6, as is shown there on the map. And that was dealt with in 1940, quite quickly. And the change point, the gauge change point, became at Königshütte. It was then decided to tackle the all-important line 4, which in those days, and indeed still, is one of the most important on the network. That was still laid in narrow gauge from the boundary at Ruderschwanska through Hebsee, or Morgenrot as it became, Lipine, to Königshütte. And work started on that in 1941. And as that happened, it then occurred to people, it should have occurred to them before, but it didn't, but it then occurred to them that they were in danger of isolating the little shuttle line 17, which you can probably just see running northeast from the word Lipini on the blue line through Schlesiengruber out to Łagiewnicki. And that was a very busy shuttle line, only about 8 minutes in length, but carried heavy traffic. And it was still, in 1941, laid in narrow gauge. It was in danger of being completely isolated from the one depot which would still be able to provide narrow gauge stock. And therefore, it was decided also that that too would be regauged. And work again commenced late in 1941 and was completed in 1942. So that by December 1942, with also the northern section from Königshütte towards Beuthen having been regauged, virtually the whole network was now in standard gauge, except for the long middle section of line 9, which I've mentioned before, and we'll see again in a minute, and also for a most remarkable survival, which was literally a fragment of track, only about 300 or 400 meters worth to the north on the old line to Pikari-Schwanski, part of the original 1894 line, which led from Rosberg Depot up to the old state boundary at Fiedlersgrube. And when the line to the depot was regauged or rather dual gauged in 1932, nobody thought to extend the new standard gauge track north of the depot and up to Pikari-Schwanski. And consequently, the local service, which terminated at the old state boundary, had to continue to be worked by narrow gauge cars, for which a couple were kept at Rosberg Depot, the only ones in the entire German section of the network. And once the main job had been done of regauging lines 4 and 6, it was decided, yes, it wouldn't be a bad idea if this last section north of Rosberg Depot was regauged. And work started on that late in 1942. We don't know exactly when. That's not being recorded. All I can say is that the new standard gauge operation over that section commenced on the 12th of December 1942. And at that point, all narrow gauge operation in the old German area came to an end. The likelihood is that narrow gauge operation had been curtailed to Rosberg Depot several weeks beforehand. But it's interesting that obviously as a wartime economy measure, new standard gauge track was not laid on the 300 or 400 meters north of Rosberg Depot, but that the track on the western side of the road was forced out, which was a technique that had been used elsewhere on the network, where the tram track was laid in the side of the carriageway. But as far as we know, this was the first and only occasion on which it was done on a tarmac surface. So by the end of 1942, we've got the whole place in standard gauge, except for those two sections. And a start was made on regauging the 9. It was done in two sections. The first one was from the boundary, the old boundary between Germany and Poland at Schomberki Mill, between there and the junction with the 4 at Morgenroth or Hebsee. That was done in 1944 and completed in 1946, but it still left the section south of Morgenroth to Antonienhütte in narrow gauge. And by this time, of course, there was no direct access on narrow gauge metals to the one remaining narrow gauge depot, which was at Łagiewnicki or Hohenlinde, as is shown here on the map. And in 1941, a temporary depot was built. This is a feature of this network, by the way. Over the years, they've built several temporary depots and later removed them. Temporary depot was built at Antonienhütte to work the remaining tramway journeys on Line 9. The regauging process then continued after the war from 1946 until 1948. And at that point, Line 9, for the first time in 18 years, became its proper form of a through service between Boyton, Bitton by then, Hebsee, and Hortzhof, as indeed it does today. So that's broadly an outline of the changes in the wartime period. And you will then say, yes, but what about that one remaining broken line that we see going east from Königshütte to Laurahütte. This was a delightful little line in really quite an area of market gardening and country, but it had originally been very busy serving the steelworks at Königshütte. And gradually, the route was curtailed. The section between Laurahütte and the junction with the 13 at Alfred plus Alfreda was converted to standard gauge in 1946, and any through passengers from Horzów who wanted to go through to Laurahütte had to change to a 13 at Alfreda. Gradually, the track was cut back as the standard gauge metals were extended until by the middle of 1951, the route had become a really short shuttle between the Market Hall at Horzów and what was known as Horzów Stary, or Old Horzów, a distance of probably about 1 mile, no more. And this was still being worked by single and coupled cars of the narrow gauge delivery of 1899, would you believe? And in late 1951, the situation come to the point where things couldn't go on much longer, and the decision was taken to close the line. And as far as we know, the last day of operation was the 31st of January 1952, bringing to an end 57 and a bit years of narrow gauge operation. Next view, please. During the wartime period, cars were brought in from Germany proper to help with the extra loading. This is a Boyton municipal tram, actually in Boyton during that period. Next, please. And in 1944, the company took delivery of a small number of the German KSW, Kriegsstrassenbahnwagen model. They had 9 motor cars in all, which actually lasted in service until 1972. And later, they received a similar batch of trailer cars built at the local tram factory in Horzów, where the Constal works. Next, please. Just a word or two about the Coalfield Tramway. Again, it became very busy during the war years, and some of the English electric cars that had opened the system in 1928 were patched up and very slightly remodeled. Here you see one. I think that this is at the northern terminus of the local line, 24, which had been introduced a few years before. There were some interesting problems with the tramways in Sosnowiec and Benzene, in that they were still being operated as a separate system, and they suffered more than the others from the fact that the large Jewish population in the east of the Upper Silesian region and in Sosnowiec had to be segregated. There was an awful lot of trouble, and a very interesting thing happened. In about 1943, the operation of this tramway network was transferred to a group of local councillors and bigwigs and what have you. And even that wasn't satisfactory, and the occupying forces felt that there was some malpractice going on with regard to revenue. And later in 1943, the undertaking was municipalized, which must be a very rare example. I don't know whether it's unique, I can't answer that, but very rare, of a new municipal tramway undertaking being created during wartime conditions. Didn't last long, but it's worth mentioning. Somebody's just asked who built the KSW motor cars. They were built by Fuchs of Heidelberg. Next, please. One other view that I showed last time, but I must show you here, shows a very interesting instance of operation where it was necessary sometimes to transfer the surviving narrow gauge cars from one part of the network to another over metals that by then had been converted to standard gauge. And this was done using railway type skates. And this remarkable view was taken probably in late 1942 with one of the two-axle German-built motor cars hauling a narrow gauge motor car on skates. The view has been published in a Polish book, but the location is incorrectly stated. It's been identified for us by a very authoritative Polish tramway expert as having been taken between Boyton and Hohenlinde, or Łagiewnicki as it became, on the tracks with the headstocks of the local mine visible in the background. Well, I hope that that gives you a broad picture of where we got to in 1945. And if we could then go, please, to the next picture. This is a map of how things were in 1951, by which time all the separate identities of the company and municipal tramways had been swept away. After 1946, the operations generally continued much as before, except that the municipal tramways in Boyton were integrated with the former company tramways in the Katowice and Bytom area. In 1948, the country, Poland, of course, now came under communist rule. And whilst it didn't actually have a great effect upon the tramways immediately, once they got their feet under the table and sorted out their most urgent problems, it was decided that something had got to be done about the provision of public transport, not just in Upper Silesia, but all over the country. And basically all the undertakings were nationalized. This had important implications, not immediately, but later, for the Upper Silesian tramways. They all came together under one big umbrella. Its initials were WPK. I don't speak fluent Polish, so I'm not going to attempt to mangle their lovely language, but we shall come back to that later. And as you can see, all the trams now are, with the exception of the 12, which I mentioned earlier, just had a few months to live, have been converted to standard gauge. And one of the first things that happens, next please, is that new rolling stock started to arrive. The tramways throughout Poland were in a most terrible state. They'd suffered terribly during the war. And although Upper Silesia itself was spared the worst of bombing and destruction right up until early 1945. During the first months of that year, and particularly in January, a lot of damage was done, and the tramways were out of service completely for several days, and to some extent for about 6 weeks. And in 1946, there was a convention of tramway engineers from all over Poland held in Katowice to decide what they were going to do about rolling stock. Most of them had seen or taken delivery of examples of the German KSW, wartime utility tram, which, all right, it was a bit square and angular, but a very robust piece of construction, almost indestructible. And the tramway engineers, to a man, said, the only thing we can have to get us back in business is more of these German KSW type trams. But buying from Germany was out of the question. And so a production line was set up at the tramway works in Chorzów to produce what became known as the Polish Normalny, or N-type car, both motor cars and trailers. And here is an example of one of the earliest of the sort, an N, which in its earliest form had hand-operated, passenger-operated actually, sliding doors. Notice, if you can, the very long platforms at each end, crush loading platforms. These little cars were scheduled to be able to carry 60 passengers and did that and more. And many of them survived until the late 1970s. In Upper Silesia, they lasted even longer, with the last of the majority being withdrawn in 1986. But as some of you will know, they have quite remarkably kept the last 3 in working order, fully overhauled, and they still appear at weekends on the line 38 in Bytom. More of that later. Next, please. These cars were built not just to run singly, which they did, and at good speed, but also to haul 1 or 2 trailers. And this was necessary on the long interurban routes, which are a feature of this network. In those days, they had 2 or 3 routes, which were around 30 kilometers of end-to-end. And I'm not saying many people made the full journey, but since there was basically no alternative, you were going to be stuck on a wooden seat for 30 kilometers on a trio of fairly loosely coupled N cars. Next, please. At the same time, some of the older cars were pensioned off, and this one is an ex-Boyton Corporation, Boyton Municipal Tramways car, built in Görlitz, I believe. It's one of the WUMAG cars, and they dated from, I think, 1914. I think I'm right there. And this one was one of 2 or 3 that ended their days as works cars on the main system. And this view was taken as late as 1985, by which time the tram was 70 years old. It is, let me just add here, I think 1,000 pities that a lot of these older cars, which had lasted until 1985, didn't quite make it into the more relaxed era of late 1989 onwards, when the possibility of preservation of some of them would have been a distinct possibility, but it didn't happen. Next, please. Here is a view of these wonderful old Walker cars, which were known as Walker cars after the electrical equipment with which they were fitted, that were the last survivors of the 1899 batch, still at work on line 12 until January 1952. I'm afraid they give the appearance of being severely careworn, but they must have been reliable to have kept going this long. And if you're wondering why they were known as Walker cars, I'll just mention that the narrow gauge of 785 millimeters presented great difficulty for the company in finding anybody who could build a powerful enough motor in the late 1890s to fit within the truck frame. And the only company that was successful in the bid was Walker of Canada, but it is believed that the motors were actually built in England, maybe under license. We don't know. There's still, however much we know, and we know a lot now about the Upper Silesian tramways, there is still a very great deal that we don't know. And we have to accept that there are gaps in our knowledge. Next, please. Amazingly, 2 of these cars were actually sold on for further service in Jelenia Góra, which is in the southwest of Poland. And the company there rebuilt the bodywork quite extensively, as you can see, but they were not successful. As you can see, they ride on maximum traction bogies. Jelenia Góra is a very hilly town, and technically, despite the improvements, they were not successful and lasted in service only about 18 months. Next, please. Now, 1938, northern section of the original 1894 route to Pikary-Szwącki was closed. This was the section isolated technically, which had to be worked as part of the corridor tram service from Katowice, which started in Poland between Katowice and the boundary at Boyton, was then in dual gauge as it went under closed operation, nobody allowed on or off with armed guards on board, until it got to the far boundary with Poland at Fiedlersgrube, and then continued for about 2 or 3 kilometers north to Pikary-Szwącki, which in those days was quite a busy centre, and also one of several pilgrimage centres in the area. You wouldn't recognise the area now. And in 1938, it was decided to close this section and also to lift the track. And at that point, Pikary-Szwącki had no alternative but for its residents and visitors to walk the 2 or 3 kilometers to the German border, and assuming they could persuade the guards to let them across, to take the local tram from there down to the main junction at Pogoda. However, that was the only significant closure of track at this stage. So next, please. And a program of extensions was opened, bearing in mind that the possibility of using motor buses was not feasible because of the heavy demands being placed on them on routes which were nowhere near tramways. And although there was a brief period of reconsidering the use of trolleybuses, this was considered not feasible at the time. So the first line that was opened was an extension of the old Hindenburg Corporation line, which had terminated at Guido Pit and went down to Makasowie, another quite important and actually profitable coal mine a couple of kilometers to the south. This was opened in 1951, although in 2 sections. This is a view taken much later in the late 1990s by which time the rolling stock had been modernised, but it shows part of the sort of territory through which this extension was laid, not well populated, under a railway bridge there, and out to the mine at Makasovi. Next, please. And here we are at Makasovi terminus. You see the headstocks of the Makasovi mine there. This was one of the last mines on the tramway, by the way, that was still working until, I think, 2015. Even now, not all the infrastructure has been removed. It's a very slow process, but the mine was closed in 2015, and with it went most of the traffic that the tramways have been built to serve. Next, please. We now come to a line of which I have no photographs, and if you were looking for a white elephant, this would be the one. It had long been proposed there should be a connection between the old Boyton municipal tramways at Rokitnitsa down to meet the Hindenburg line at Mikulčice. It had been proposed on several occasions between the wars, and on one occasion that locals had tried to interest the mayor and corporation of Boyton into constructing the line, but they had more sense and told them to go away. They weren't in the slightest bit interested, and with good reason. But in 1949-50, different views were propounded. Bear in mind that the tramways are now under nationalisation, and as ever, money is easily wasted when it's allocated from a long distance away, and it was decided that this extension would be built. And it was laid in single track and almost entirely, if not entirely, on private right-of-way, including a special bridge over a watercourse, or on reserved track. From the start, things went wrong. The track was very poorly laid, and the blame for that has been laid on the imported labour that was brought in to lay the track, labour from the Ukraine. The service was not frequent, and although it did indeed connect with the old Hindenburg Corporation line through to Guido Mine and later to Makasovi, there was only one through tram every 2 hours. So very few people were prepared to wait for that. And most of the potential traffic moved over to local motorbus services, however inadequate they were. Things went on until the number of derailments apparently became insufferable, and it was decided, quite rightly, not to relay the track, but to close the line. And this happened in 1968. So it was one of the shorter-lived builds on the network. But then we came to another one, which was line 18. And this was interesting in that it recreated a line that had been built as narrow gauge in 1901 and abandoned in 1907. During the period when the tramways were being laid left, right, and centre, the company discovered the traffic on this line didn't come up to expectations or predictions. And probably quite rightly, they made application to the railway commissioners in Opoye, I think. Yeah, I think that's right, to close the line. And this was unheard of. These people were used to granting licenses for new tramways. It can't be right that somebody wants to close a line, particularly one that's only been open for 8 years. And they quietly sent a delegation of inspectors over to Ruder-Schwanska to see what was going on. And to their astonishment, they found when the report came back that the delegation entirely sympathised with the company's position, saying that there was absolute dearth of traffic, there was little prospect of any improvement, and the company should be allowed to close the line. And permission was given, and they did indeed close it in 1907 and lifted the rails, and that was that. Well, the trouble was that passengers from each end of the line, which I suppose was probably about 4 kilometres in total length, something like that, had a desire to reach Ruder-Schwanska centre, and particularly because there was a station there on the main railway. And again, after 1948, a lot of noise was made locally to the effect that they would like their tramway back. And in 1954, the powers that be agreed that they should relay the track, obviously in standard gauge by then, but they were a bit slow about it. Everything moved very slowly in Poland at that time, and it doesn't move very fast now, I have to say. The track was laid from starting at the southern end, where it met the long east-west line at a point which is known as Ruda Południowa, South Ruda. And gradually the rails reached Ruda Station, and with a further 2 extensions, by 1960, it had met up with the line 5 from Bytom to Żarcie, and a new connection that was laid in at each end, and a new route 18 was opened. And I'm not sure that really it did a lot better than it had done in 1901. And it was always a bit of an embarrassment, I think. The service, which for many years had been a standard 20-minute service, and when it terminated at Ruda Południowa, could be worked with 3 sets, which gave it a reasonable chance of being profitable. But then when converted to single-ended car operation, it was necessary, and there was no room or willingness to build a turning circle. There had to be a long extension, which pushed the car allocation up to 5. And on a 20-minute service, where there was already a frequent service over the remaining section that had been introduced, it gave it really no hope at all of turning a profit. And gradually, the frequency was reduced from 5, first to 4, and then to 3 vehicles on an inevitably an irregular interval every 20/40, 20/40 minutes, that sort of thing. And passenger traffic dwindled away. Its fate was sealed, I think, with the unfortunate fact that it ran for most of its itinerary through the local authority district of Ruder-Schwanska. You must bear in mind that this tramway served at one time 15 local authority districts. By the time we got to here, it was down to 13. But nevertheless, each one of them had got its own ideas of what should be done, its own special pleadings to be met. And Ruder-Schwanska in particular was known as being one of the most anti-tram of the local authorities served by Tramway Schwanski. And they made it clear that they wanted new track and they wanted new trams, and they wanted them now. And they couldn't have them because new track and new trams were much more urgently required on several other trunk routes. And the arguments went on for some months, and eventually the deterioration in the condition of the track was such that the company decided that it had no option but to close the line. And that happened in February 2015. since when some, but not all, of the track has been lifted, but there is no prospect, I understand, of there being any reinstatement of service. Next, please. That's a view of the typical single track layout in Ruda at St Joseph's Church. You can see that the track isn't exactly the best of lays, and the quality of the ride on this section, as you might imagine, was none too good. Next, please. Well, then we have another white elephant, really, or what became a white elephant to show you, which was the extension of line 8. Now, the 8 had taken over the section of track laid by Boyton municipality and opened in 1927. Yeah, 1927. The period after the war led to a suggestion that should be tracks laid through the nearby settlement of Tramways of Upper Silesia. And this was done in 3 stages. And perhaps you can see the pointlessness of it all when I show you this view of the last stage up to a turning circle at the edge of the settlement, which was intended to serve the Andalusia coal mine, which you can just make out in the distance, and was a good kilometre or perhaps a bit more away from the tram. There were competing bus services from the outset, and I'm jumping ahead a bit when it comes to chronology, but when the time came for the reorganisation and refinancing of the tramway, the local authority here, which was Pikari Schwansky, was one of 2 who said, sorry, we don't want your trams, we're not paying anymore, you can please yourself. And it was decided that the line 8 should be closed. And that took place in March 2006. Next, please. This is perhaps a better view as to why there was hardly any traffic remaining on the tramway at the end. The industry, slight though it was, that had been bordering the tramway once it was extended in 1952, had gone, was completely demolished, and the trams were, I'm afraid, just going around for the most part carrying fresh air. Next, please. However, a happier situation arose at the extreme southeast of the tramway network in the town of Mysłowice, or what had been Mysłowice, which had a thriving coal mine and had been served right up to the railway station with the opening of the narrow gauge in 1900. During the early 1920s, the track was actually cut back to this point, which is Mysłowice, or Mysłowice, as it was then, Rathaus or Town Hall, which was, I don't know, 500 or 600 yards walk from the railway station. I've never understood why, but that's what happened. In 1953, it was at last decided that the standard gauge metals should be extended back to the railway station. And this was done in conjunction with the introduction of another series of routes that linked the coalfield with parts of the old Upper Silesian network. Next, please. There were 3 routes. The 26 linked Sosnowiec, which is the biggest of the towns served in the coalfield, by a completely new route with Mysłowice. And this shot off to the east of Sosnowiec and then south and crossed the river, which had been the border between Austria and Russia in the early days of the tramway, and ended up terminating here at Mysłowice railway station. And on the left, as you see, a car on the 14 and a train on the 26 on the right. Next, please. The 26 was actually quite an adventurous departure for the WPK, because it included a number of quite substantial engineering works, including this tram-only bridge over the alternative road route between Mysłowice and Dandowka. And this was taken during a period when part of the sidewalling was down whilst they were reconstructing the bridge and the track. Next, please. Now, in Sosnowiec were to be found many older trams, such as these English electric built cars, were imported from England in 1927 to open the Coalfield Tramway in 1928. The tramway did not change much until well after the war, and the main route was the 21 from here, from Sosnowiec, right through to Rheden, and later on the 22 from here to Chelaj. Next, please. Here's another view at Sosnowiec station, as was with one of the English electric cars shunting on line 22, having arrived from Chelaj, and a trailer which it is busy running round. Next, please. One of the features of this era was the introduction in a number of places of turning loops to replace the stub terminals that had been a feature of the system, which had never had any loops, by the way, until one was installed at Place Alfreda in 1942. Several were built. This is one at Milovice to the east, to the west of Sosnowiec. It's actually a two-track loop segregated by that rather rough greensward in the middle, and it replaced a stub terminal where the N-class cars had to shunt their trailers. Next, please. Another one more typical of the area is that a suburb of Zabrze called Zaborze, and this is a loop known as the loop at Ulica Lumpy, Ulica being street. It survives to this day, not as busy as it was, but the 4 in those days was a trunk route crossing Zabrze that went from here to Gliwice, and the old Bielsowice colliery, one of many in the area, just visible in the background. Next, please. A short series of 13N motor cars was delivered in 1960 or 61. And here's a pair of them, 301 and 302 in Katowice. These were the type that were standard deliveries to Warsaw in those years. And Upper Silesia was the only other tramway in Poland to receive any. There were 6 of them. Next, please. Now, yes, here we are. Here's a map of the system in 1962. And you'll probably notice, possibly notice some features. One is the long extension up here of a route 25 from Sosnowiec and Benzin to Ipswich. And this wasn't so much a white elephant as almost a plaything. I'll show you some photographs of it in a moment. And there were other developments as well. But mainly it was a period of consolidation. Next, please. And different types of rolling stock were being tried now. This 2 rooms and a bath, very shaky bath, I might say, rolling stock was fabricated by the undertaking itself. 4 of them were built by the Hortsoff wagon works, but the other 7 were reconstructions of withdrawn end motor and trailer cars and a newly built centre section. They did not have a long life on this system. They entered service in 1962 and 63 and were withdrawn in 1975. And this one is shown working on line 5, which was one of their haunts from here at Zaborze Ulumpi through Zabrze to Bytom. Next, please. But something had to be done to replace the N cars, which were good old solid servants, but something rather better was needed. And here is an articulated version of the 13N, the only one that Tramway Schwansky took. It's a 14N car articulated version seen in Katowice. Next, please. And then came the batch of 102 type articulated cars, 102N and 102NA. The first 20 that arrived in Katowice came with this very unusual frontal design of a reverse rake windscreen, and it had been designed by a group of artists or industrial artists, whatever you like to say, in Warsaw. And it was quite evident very quickly that none of them had ever driven a tram, because the arrival of these cars was the subject of absolutely enormous complaints from the staff about the reflection from the windscreen, particularly at times like dusk and daybreak, and also during the hours of darkness. And although it was intended to build 40-something of this design, only 20 were built, all of which came here to Katowice. It was not long before they were confined either to minor routes or to the second car in a 2-car train of articulated cars. And the remaining 100, of which they took delivery, were built with conventional raked windscreens. Next, please. Here's one of the more conventional 102NA articulated cars. They proliferated on the system and were found on almost all the trunk long lines. And the last of them was taken out of service in 2008. Next, please. This is one of the 2-car trains of articulated rolling stock, one of each type. As you see, you can see there the leading car with a conventional windscreen and towing the 102N with the reverse rake windscreen. None of the 102Ns were ever rebuilt with conventional windscreens. Next, please. After the 102 type came the 105, a standard bogie car, of which many hundreds were built for all the tramways in Poland. And for Tramway Śląski, the total deliveries were just under 500. This is a view at Plus Alfreda, where the 12, by now regauged, of course, and the 13 met. And it gives a good opportunity to compare the front and rear elevations of these cars. Very basic. I had a lot of trouble with them when to start, particularly with the doors. Several drivers used to carry big hammers with them in the cab. When the doors wouldn't close, they'd get out and give the mechanism a big whump, and it would slam shut. But they were very unsatisfactory to start with, although as time went on, their performance improved. Next, please. And here's a view of one on the Coalfield Tramway in Benzine, with a typical piece of communist era architecture there. That is the Benzine Palace of Culture. And the pedestrian wielding the wheelchair, having to run the gauntlet of ordinary traffic and the trams. Not very satisfactory. Next, please. We come then to Route 38, as it is now. It had been 35. This is a very short route in Bytom, 1.3 kilometers in length. And it was originally built so that the Boyton municipal tramways could have access to its main line, which went through the centre of the town. The depot of the Boyton municipal tramways was behind in the distance, where you can just see that motor bus poking out. But in 1941, it was found that the demand for tram service was such that a regular service had to be introduced over this depot connection. And there was one ever since until 1980, when, as part of what appears now to have been an attempt to close some of the tramways in this area, it was summarily withdrawn and everybody was made to walk. But a big row erupted, and most unusually, under the communist regime, some notice was taken of it. And after a lot of pressure was brought to bear, the route was reinstated. By then, its number had been taken by another one, but it was reopened as line 38, in which form it survives today. Next, please. This is a view at Bytom Depot, which was opened in 1968. And one of the reasons for this was that a huge new housing estate was built to the north of Bytom in an area that had never seen a tram before. And it was decided that a tram service should be provided between the centre of Bytom and Radzionkov here. And at one time, it was the most frequent route on the system, with a 6-minute service of single cars. But that has dropped away now, and it's normally coupled cars every 15 or 20 minutes. And that was opened at a time when the old narrow gauge depot in Rosbach was decommissioned for trams. Next, please. This is a view taken on the new line laid between Bytom and the Radzionkov housing estate. And it's like that still today, semi-rural, with long sections without compulsory stops. Next, please. Other changes included the relaying and remodelling of the old junction at Pagoda in the east of Bitom. The trams had originally come down the road that you see there to the left of the picture. That's the main Hutsoff Road, and you can just in the background make out the headstocks of Rosbart Colliery. But in 1972, a new alignment was developed, mainly on private right-of-way, and the trams were withdrawn from that section of Hotsoff Street. And as you see, one coming across here on a temporary route 31. Next, please. And then came a big change in Bitom. There's always been some difficulty, I think, in devising a suitable network in Bitom. There was no really satisfactory place for a big terminus, although one was constructed in the central square at was it Kosciuszki, and that actually has served ever since 1930 as the main tramway terminus, three-track tram station. But other routes had to navigate side roads and side streets, and the Highway Authority decided that it would introduce a one-way traffic system in Bitom. And in late 1971, there was a complete recasting of the local route network, which resulted in several changes. And it brought trams to this street, Moniuszki Street, with some quite nicely restored buildings. Bitom, I should say, which had been the entire hub of the Upper Silesian area, lost its status definitely in 1945. It's been superseded by Katowice itself. But the one advantage it has is that of all the local towns outside Katowice, it is the one that has most nearly retained its old architecture and in parts resembles what I imagine was the Germany of the Kaiser era. Next, please. Yeah, I've got this is a map of the tramway routes as they were in 1981, and this shows the revised layout in Bitom, Katowice. And I should mention that in 1949, the old line north to Pikary-Szwącki was relayed in standard gauge and reopened quite remarkably, but it didn't last all that long. By 1980, it had been reduced to a shuttle service from Pagoda, and eventually really withered on the vine and was closed in 1981. And I think that was part of the scheme that was in the background of people's thinking to close a lot of the tramways radiating from Bitom. Next, please. The big problem was the surviving former Städtische Straßenbahn-Beuthen lines, which went out to rural communities to the west or northwest of Bitom. Here, minimal maintenance had been done to the track. There were no turning loops, so the main routes that had to be worked with trailers had involved a shunt at the far end. And whilst this was a major loss in terms of trackage, when it was announced that these routes would close in May 1983, the excuse was that the track under the railway viaduct at Mikovica was in a very poor condition and needed rebuilding. None of that work was ever done. And although Tramway Śląskie has in recent years harboured ambitions to go back to Mikowice and hasn't completely ditched them, it now seems rather unlikely that that will happen. Next, please. Here's another view at one of these rural termini, the Hayway in there, passing the trams, shunting. Next, please. And the 31 was not allowed completely to die a death. It was cut back very severely to the limit of the urban development in Bitom, and one solitary N car provided a shuttle service here for several years, pending the extension of the track to a new turning circle outside or to serve the Bitom Polytechnic, in the shadow of the old steelworks. Next, please. The 38, however, carried on, as I've mentioned, single track all the way, no passing loop, and it was one car shuttling every 20 to 30 minutes. But oddly enough, the traffic survived and prospered and grew as the years progressed. And when I was privileged to interview the general manager of Tramway Śląskie in 2006, I specifically asked how long he hoped to be able to keep running the 38 and with an N car. And he and his traffic manager both said, "We hope forever," which was quite charming when you consider that this was the last outpost of this type of tram anywhere in Poland. Next, please. There was, however, an extension of metals at the far end of the coalfield tramway to Huta Katowice, this giant coalfield and power station that you see there, and a track which could really do with a weed killer car going over it, but there we are. Next, please. And by the time this was introduced, changes were taking place on the rolling stock front, and some of the better conditioned 105N cars were sent away for rebodying. 3 people did them. The tramway in Łódź, their own workshops in Chorzów Batory, and Modetrans of Poznań. And this is one of the Modetrans vehicles, which have become much the more numerous by now. Again, seen outside the terminus at Huta Katowice. Next, please. In 1980 came the last extension, or at least the last extension for 40 years. This was a new Route 15, temporarily worked as a 35, whilst the track was being laid, in Sosnowiec, up to a new housing estate in the area known as Zagorze. This was taken whilst the work was still proceeding, and the line was not complete. Next, please. And there the tramway remained static for several years. This, however, was the terminal point of that Zagorze extension, and there it remained for 40 years. Next, please. Now, as you know, in 1989, there were extreme political changes in Poland. It was, in fact, the first of the Eastern European communist satellite states to fall to a democratic process. And in November of that year, the communist authorities were swept from power and a whole new world opened up. And the Poles, being a very enterprising people, I have to say, they don't let the grass grow under their feet, seize their opportunities with both hands. One of the things that happened was that the government decided that the huge number of state assets that it owned, which in many cases were state liabilities, should be sold off. And with 14 tramways in Poland, it was announced that all would be offered for sale, and 13 of them were snapped up relatively quickly because they operated entirely, or to all intents and purposes, almost entirely in the areas of their local authorities. And therefore, the municipal authority in each place bought their tramway. The problem arose, of course, with Tramway Śląskie. It served at that time 13 local authority areas, no one of which could possibly consider buying the whole lot. And it's a classic example of the old saying, everybody's property is nobody's property. And none of the authorities was prepared to stump up the money, particularly as the asking price was wholly unreasonable. The state treasury wanted a payment for a full going concern plus an indemnity to cover all the accumulated assets or deficits that had accumulated in the previous years. Nobody was prepared to do that. And for a while, the undertaking sort of leapt on. It kept going, but with decreasing subsidies year by year from the Polish state treasury. This is a view taken in 1993 when the company or the undertaking had been reformed as PKT. To imply local ownership, not nationalised. The management told me that at this period, they were unable to make any charges to capital funds because the revenue just wasn't there, even when supported with subsidies. And the amount of renewals that they were able to do, both in terms of track and wiring, decreased year by year. And in 1998, they were actually reduced to removing spare bits of track from depots when they had a broken rail somewhere because there was no money around to finance new purchases. The tramway was dying on its feet. But as sometimes happens, there was a knight in shining armour in the background. Stepped forward the mayor of Hortzow. Hortzow, although not the most auspicious of towns in the area, is one with the greatest concentration of tramway operation and tramway traffic. And it had as its mayor at that time a very pro-tramway man. And the local Transportation Authority, KZK GOP, which had been formed some years previously, had representatives from all the local authorities that its services served, and that included motor buses. So there were, in fact, 35 local authorities represented on that body. The mayor browbeat his colleagues in the other tramway boroughs to come together and contribute towards purchasing the tramway, because it was his belief that he could get it on more favourable terms. And metaphorically speaking, he went knocking on the National Treasury door at frequent intervals, saying, "Are you willing to sell?" And the answer came back, "Yes, on our terms. Go away." And this went on for a little while until one day he metaphorically knocked on the door and spoke to the treasurer and said, "Are you willing to sell?" And he had a different answer. He had make me an offer. And he said, well, I'm telling you, I don't mind. We can get together a consortium to pay for it as a going concern, but I'm not paying you anything for the deficits. That's your problem. You can't expect us to do that. And he said, I must have something for the deficits. Make me an offer. And he said, oh, all right, 1 zloty. And the treasurer said, I take it. And with that, the tramway changed hands. Took a little longer, of course, to complete the formalities, but it was now owned by its municipalities, with Hortsuf having taken the lead. And from then onwards, it has been a much happier story. Of course, there have been ups and downs. You'd expect that, but it was no longer in hock to the national government. Next, please. One of the first things that happened was that the railway announced that the overbridge crossing the mainline railway at Gliwice had got to be rebuilt. It was unsafe, and it would be closed to all traffic for a period of what turned out to be 3 years. This was a big problem for the tramway, what they did, next please, was to take 6 of their 105N single-ended cars and send them back to the works at Hortsuf to be converted into double-sided cars that could be coupled back to back as 2-car trains. This enabled them to operate a shuttle service from the far side of the railway bridge in Gliwice up to their tram terminus, which was all the way through the other side of the town. Next, please. And again, they did something which the undertaking has done many times over the years. It erected a temporary depot at Wojtłowiec, which is where this view was taken. And here's one of these rebuilt cars poking out of the depot, which could do routine maintenance and minor repairs. And this lasted for 3 years. Next, please. There was also, during this period, an incredible situation where a fleet of new low-floor cars was ordered from the tramway works at Hortsuf, known as the Constal 116 ND. Delivered originally in a battleship grey livery, they've later been equipped with horrible contravision advertising, or some are in fleet livery. This is a view in the centre of Katowice at a temporary terminus for the important local Route 16, whilst track work was going on elsewhere. Next, please. Also, to ease the rolling stock shortage, a series of cars, 20 of them in fact, were required from Krakow, with whom Tramway Śląskie has a good relationship. And before there was time to repaint them, they were put into service in Krakow's blue and white livery, and given the Krakow fleet number with a supplementary K. This is a view in the centre of Żarcie in early 2007. Next, please. During this period, there was some concern raised as to the future of 1 or 2 bits of the tramway. Tramway Śląskie itself knew that there was the possibility of accessing European Union grants in aid for infrastructure improvements. As part of the accession agreement, Poland joined the EU in 2004. It came to their notice that the local highway authority was preparing a big dossier of all the work it wanted to do to improve the highways, build new ones, rebuild old ones, and so forth, in the whole of Upper Silesia. And Tramway Śląskie got in on the act and asked to prepare a report setting out the work that they needed to do to put the tramway into good order. And by Jove, it was a lot of work, with a track network in excess of 200 kilometres, the great majority of which needed to be rebuilt. It was no mean feat. Their submission was included in the report, and it was sent to the European Commission. I rather have the impression from things that I've heard that their hands went up in horror at the thought that there was somewhere in the European Union still daring to run a network of interurban tramways that went out with the arc as far as they were concerned. They couldn't believe it. But nevertheless, the report was received, and they sort of did a rudimentary exercise as to what would be involved financially, and said, we're not prepared to commit money to this sort of project on this scale without some evidence that it would be money well spent, because we could be throwing money down the drain. And therefore our proposal is to submit this to perusal and what have you by a firm of consultants, and this they did. When I heard that, my heart sank, because in my experience, consultants and tramways don't really go hand in hand. You might strike lucky, but not always. And so we just sat back and waited, and things went on. And this is unbelievably true. I was sitting at home one summer's evening, actually, supping a well-deserved glass of beer, and the phone rang. And, oh, all right, I'll go and pick it up. And it was a friend of mine from Warsaw, ringing me at home, expensive for those people. And he said, Mike, I have some news for you. Yes, what is it? He said, the consultants have reported. Oh, no. I said, and what is it? It is wonderful, he said. They've said that the tramway has the potential to provide the basis of a completely new, revamped light rail system for the entire Upper Silesian region, which cannot support a further investment in heavy rail. And our only concern is that there are two sections of the tramway which probably can't survive. One is the street running section through Gliwice, and the other is our famous Route 18 through Ruda-Śląska, where traffic is very slight. But other than that, we are prepared to go ahead. And with that call, I knew that the tramway was saved. I couldn't believe it, but it happened. And within a matter of days, Tramway Śląskie was making inquiries as to where it could get suitable double-ended cars with which it could run shuttle services whilst track was being rebuilt. They lighted upon the Duwag cars in Frankfurt am Main, and in early 2008, I think it was, one car was sent on an overnight journey from Frankfurt to Horsov Batary for testing to make sure that clearances and so forth would be satisfactory. And of course, this was a big car, a big 3-section articulated low-floor car. And it acquitted itself very well. There were no physical problems. I think the management was absolutely delighted. And within a very short period, they had ordered 10 cars from Frankfurt, with another 2 supplied accident victims that were not capable of running again. Later, a further 5 were obtained, and actually they would love to have obtained many, many more, because they have been very satisfactory to them. But the problem was that the first 10 came under a contract under which Frankfurt would remove the asbestos in the cars. But after the next 5, which they agreed to do reluctantly, Frankfurt refused to do any more asbestos removal. And Tramways Schwanske itself was not prepared to do that. And that was the end of buying from Frankfurt. But then also there were some cars from Vienna, which we'll see in just a moment. Let me just move on through the pictures. We have the next one. This is a car on Route 8, by the way, one of those that was actually to close. And in the background, you see the Rosbach mine headstocks and a chimney. Yeah, next, please. This is a view on line 25, which was a very late piece of construction, 1959, and it had all the hallmarks of being a throw-off from the Belgian vicinal, with a single track and loop through quiet country lanes and side streets. Next, please. The 25 and the 8 were both closed in April 2006. It gave rise, the closure of the 25 gave rise to something unheard of, I think, in that the mayor of Benzine, in whose town the tram terminated, could not bear the thought of the 25 being abandoned, and threatened to go on hunger strike if it proceeded. And for a few months, a very sparse service of a short 25 within the borough of Benzine was reopened. But the timetable was absolutely hopeless. Nobody would wait around for it. And eventually, the money ran out, and the mayor had to admit that his protests had been in vain. But it was an indication, I think, of the support that the tramway still had amongst local people, despite its operating problems of recent years. Next, please. And this is a view on the 12, which is another route. It wasn't abandoned quite at the same time. It was a year or so later. This is in Hortsof-Stari, Old Hortsof. And this delightful little line wandered across the countryside, an articulated car mainly every 12 minutes. Next, please. But it also served an area of mining in Hortsof, and there it is passing what by then were the closed pieces of infrastructure of President Mine, which is now a mining museum. Next, please. Here's a view of one of the Frankfurt cars after repainting into Tramway Schwanske livery on the stub track at St. Elizabeth's Church in Hortsof. This track actually gave connection to the tramway works, the Constal works, but under the realignment procedure, which is going on at the present time, that connection has been severed. Next, please. And in addition to the Frankfurt cars, Tramways Schwanske bought over 20 of these loaner cars from Vienna, and put them through their own works, refurbishing them quite extensively. And these were put to work on routes from Gliwice Depot and Benzine Depot, the one on the 26. Next, please. Another view of one of these Vienna cars. Next, please. And inside, and as you see, new seats, not the wooden seats that would have been the case in Vienna, but all fitted with advertisement panels, part of the new administration of Tramways Shronski, advertising the availability of trams, old and new, for hire. This was at a time, next please, when its image was being greatly improved. Here we are, new moquette-covered seats on the trams with the Tramway Shronski monogram. Great improvement over those dreadful moulded plastic seats that went before. Next, please. And the whole thing generally improved with new rolling stock coming in at regular intervals, rebodied, refitted. Next, please. And this is one of the first of the Modetrans cars that were belatedly put to work on Route 1 in Ipswich in its last weeks of operation, by which time I'm afraid it was far too late. The mayor, very anti-tram, had made his decision. Next, please. And that's a side view of one of these Modetrans rebodied cars. Next, please. But later came the delivery of new low-floor cars, and they now represent well over half the fleet. This is a very interesting view. It's one of their first batch of fully low-floor cars. They're built by Pacer of Big Gosh, a company that was hived off from the State Railway Works. It's actually on a stretch of track on line 15, which has been doubled and relayed from being side running on reservation to double track in the street. A very rare example on Tramway Shronski of a conversion to street running. Next, please. Here's another one of these three-section Constal low-floor cars of the first batch, of which there were 30 seen at Katowice marketplace. Next, please. At the same time, a series of 10 cars, later increased to 12, was built up for the company by Modetrans of Poznań. The two end sections of this three-section car are fabricated from rebuilt withdrawn N-class 105N cars, and the centre section is a new low-floor body section. So there are 12 of these, and they're double-ended, so come in very useful when track relaying is going on. Next, please. Of the Frankfurt cars were very popular, although the doors were a bit slow in opening, but they were in such good condition that the company decided not to scrap them, but to rebuild them as single-ended cars with a low-floor centre section. This is the last of them being done in their own works at Horsdorf-Batory, and this was a very major job because the Frankfurt cars had all the control equipment under their original centre section. So that all had to be renewed and removed. Next, please. And the resulting car looks like this. This is one operating in the Coalfield Tramway. Next, please. Another view of one in Biskupice. They apparently have proved very popular with the travelling public. Next, please. And an amazing order, really, was for a small number of these bogie cars built by Modetrans of Poznań. Originally, the order was for 8 of these cars in single-ended form, and another 5 were added later. but also for 2, later increased to 3, in double-ended form to provide new rolling stock for the 38 in Biton. Next, please. They were put to work in 2020. Here's one of its first journeys on a peak hour extra route, route Naught. That's a very Polish thing, by the way, route Naught, at Katowice market. Next, please. And 2 examples of a later type of low floor articulated car, 3-section, but shorter than the first batch. There's 27 of these, and another 5 were added later. And again, 2 of them passing in Katowice. Next, please. And at the same time as they arrived, another 8 of these 3-section cars, the longer version, arrived. Next, please. They haven't neglected completely their history. This 105N of one of the first deliveries, 1975, was rebuilt into more or less original form, and comes out on high days and holidays and special route 23. It was running here on the 36 in Katowice. Next, please. And the other occupant of the service on line 23 is this 13N car, which the company acquired from Warsaw, never having had any of their own, repainted and numbered 308. It's also seen at Katowice. Next, please. I mentioned that the mayor of Gliwice had got it in for the trams, and he had his way in 2009. This is in on the street track in Gliwice, passing the old Huta Gliwice steelworks in the background on line 1. Next, please. And apparently, the reason for wanting the withdrawal of the trams was because they caused traffic congestion in the centre of Gliwice. Well, this is the central shopping street of Gliwice, and I see no evidence of that on this Friday morning. The mayor of Gliwice, by the way, has taken his bag and walked, and now sits in the Polish National Parliament. Next, please. That's another view in Gliwice. It was a lovely line, and it was single track, worked in both directions under signal control around the line of the old town walls. Next, please. I mentioned that Gliwice had played, Ruda Swanska had played difficulty over line 18. And in February 2015, the end was brought about. Here's a view of it on the single track line at the side of the road in Ruda Swanska. Next, please. The company did say that they did have a problem in that they'd had 2 serious accidents on this road, one very serious actually, and the track was desperately in need of relaying, but the local authority was not willing to allow it to be doubled. And coming head to head with an oncoming tram in heavy weather on the wrong side of the road isn't really the sort of thing you want to encounter these days. Next, please. Nor is this situation with everybody marching out into the middle of the road to board a tram on the wrong side of the road, heading south to Ruda Południowa. Next, please. And we have then a map of in 2015, I'm, oh dear, look at the time. Well, I'll speed up. We're not long now. we're at the situation where a new Transport Coordinating Authority, ZTM, has taken over from KZK-GOP, and KZTM is extremely pro-tram and sees an increasing role for the tramway in the area and is promoting new and extended lines. Next, please. This is a view in the new Gliwice depot, opened some time ago now, but a good example of a modern workshop where the trams are washed and cleaned before going into the maintenance bay. Next, please. One great advantage of the new ZTM is that the spate of closures has stopped. Of course, there are several works cars in the fleet, mainly snow ploughs and lorries. I'll just show one or two. Next, please. These are a couple parked up at Gliwice depot, and this one converted from one of their 13N bogie cars into a wire trailer seen during rewiring works in Hortzhof. Next, please. Here's the permanent way gang at work in Zarbshay, having been sent to clean out the points on this crossover, very seldom used, but they managed just to get through to me that it was going to be put into use on the next day because of some special track works, which was very kind. The staff, I might say, throughout Tramway Swansgate are extremely friendly, but we may not be able to converse frequently, but they are very helpful and friendly, and I think generally rather proud of their tramway. Next, please. Here's a view of the last surviving 102N articulated car, which was reduced to driver training duties, and since withdrawal has been kept at the works at Hortzhof Batory, ready for its turn in the restoration queue. That's their intention, to restore it. Next, please. This is the set that was their original historic set, 1100 and the trailer, N and ND. They use them on special services when there is something to be celebrated, and it doesn't take much to get them to find an excuse. And here it is in Katowice. Next, please. It's not a Katowice tram at all, but this tramway monument stands in the middle of the roundabout at Hibsey. It's actually a car, an N-class car, 5N, actually, from Elbląg, which is a tramway right up in the Baltic reaches of Poland. So quite what that was doing being brought here, I don't know. But the livery of a horrible brown ochre is apparently a pun on the name of Ruda Śląska, because that actually is Polish for sort of this brown ochre shade, so I'm told. Next, please. And there, under ZTM, there has been a whole tranche of track works, including for the first time betterment. So here we see two cars short working on Route 7, a very long route, very ancient and very long route at Łagiewnicki, whilst the track between there and Bytom was renewed. Next, please. And this is at the other end of that, at the junction at Bytom Railway Bridge, where special traffic management was laid in with the temporary traffic signals and the use of this rare curve whilst track relaying was taking place. Next, please. Sometimes extra stops are put in and they're found to be particularly useful. This is on Route 9, when a shuttle service running as Route 10 was in operation whilst track was being relayed in Novi Bytom. Next, please. And a very interesting one is here at Łagiewnicki Old Depot, which was closed to tramway operation in 1980, but remained in Tramway Śląski ownership until a couple of years ago, and had a full triangular junction, and it was very often used as a turning point for short working trams whilst track work was taking place between here and Bytom. And here's a situation with a two-car train reversing in and an articulated low-floor car coming out. Next, please. This is where the work gets quite heavy. This is in, oh gosh, I've forgotten the name of it now, Sopienica, which is east of Katowice, where quite a complicated junction. It was originally 2 loads of single line, but it will, and I think it will become so because the works are still going on. We've got temporarily a track for a double line and a single. Next, please. And right in the centre of Katowice, don't think of driving your car through here whilst all this is going on. The whole of the main street was dug up for new track, and Plac Wolności, which is a terminal point for a number of tram routes, was also fully engaged in the works. Next, please. This was an interesting operation on part of line 18, temporarily working as line 10, with a pair of these 111N cars, the ones that were rebuilt for Gliwice Bridge Works. And the running time here was very tight indeed. And the work involved a mid-route reverse, and it was so tight that they really could not allow time for the motorman to walk from the one end of one car to the other end of the other and do his pantograph and so forth. So we had the remarkable situation of these 2-car trains being worked by 2 men, a motorman in each cab, one driving the tram, and as soon as it got to Ruda Południe over, the other chap had to put away his newspaper, sit up, put the pantograph up and go off to the other direction. Next, please. A very complicated piece of work was when the track was relayed in Bytom some years ago. So a major hub of the tram network. And normally this is one way for trams in the opposite direction. This had to be worked with a very long section of single track. And so long that it was very easy for the service to become dislocated and cars had to run through in convoy. Next, please. And when it got to the end of the single line section, there we are, everybody marching out into the road to get on the tram on the wrong track. Next, please. Here's what the Germans call a Kletterweiche, which are, you know, a climbing point. And this is whilst the track was being renewed on the line 5 a couple of years ago. Next, please. And you can see the extent of the relay. This is in Lipini, very old section and very run down part, I might say. The prefabricated concrete sections have been laid in, ready to receive the rail. Next, please. And that's actually the same location, just a few yards further on, looking up the street, which has been completely dug up for resurfacing. Now the tramway is back. Next, please. This is at Sosnowiec during a heavy rainstorm when the track was being used in the wrong direction because of the limitations of the track layout and the need to preserve the routes. Next, please. And here was a surprise for motorists coming through Bobrek when these twin car sets were working wrong road, heading, well, it would be north at this point, and heavy lorries would have to squeeze past on the near side. Next, please. And I'm just going to show you a few examples of degraded track, because there was a lot of it before the rebuilding took place. This is in Jarveje, which is just outside Katowice. Next, please. You can go through these fairly quickly, Roberto, and that's the track that replaced it. Complete new private right-of-way. I love this with the railway, the railway level crossing being renewed and the trams continuing to run, which is in Novi Bytom by the steelworks. Here we see one of the old interwar border points everywhere where there was a border crossing the tramway. There was a house in which the border guards kept a watch on what was going on. Next, please. And this is the same route rebuilt now with double track on private I was going to say private right of way, but reserved track. Next, please. This is the emerging from a new subway on the line 15 to Zagorze, which was one of the first to be totally reconstructed. Next, please. And a very nice new tramway station at Hortzhof opened in 2015, 4-track layout. Next, please. Here's a view on the other end of the 15, heading towards Sosnowiec on the old roadside line, which has been superseded by double track in the street. Next, please. And another example there of this street running double track, which has taken over from the side running single track. Next, please. Quite a contorted location, this, where the tram emerges from in amongst the trees to go onto single track in the middle of the road and almost immediately diverges onto double track. This section has now been completely rebuilt on the 11. Next, please. And this is a view in Bytom, Katowice Street, with the single track tramway, worked in both directions, may I say, which has now been relayed completely in double track for the first time in 124 years. Quite remarkable. Next, please. And that is the new double track, and some of the buildings have had a facelift. Hopefully some of the rest will as well. And this is one of the Moditram's bogie cars in use on local routes. Next, please. Last views now of some industry and some quirks. If you look around, there are still some good industrial building architecture to be found. This is part of the old zinc works at Burowiec, and according to my guidebook, it dates from 1834. Next, please. The electricity works outside Zabrze is a massive piece of construction, and it was built at about the time when electric tramways first came to Zabrze, 1899. Next, please. This is the remains of the old coal mine, where the new turning circle for Beton Polytechnic has been constructed. Next, please. And in the days when Rospark was still a functioning or partly functioning coal mine, it proclaimed itself at the tram stop of the same name. This was in 2004, but all this is now gone. Next, please. One of my favourite locations was in Mysłowice, a very famous and important coal mine, which was quite historic in the history of mining, by the way, and with its 3 headstocks still in operation for the most part, and one of the 102NA Arctic cars passing on Route 14, which is the line from Mysłowice. Only one of the headstocks survives now. Next, please. And here's a view of a similar car climbing past what remains of the closed Königshütte steelworks, the one that began work in 1792 and closed in 1999. Next, please. Again, the remains of an old zinc works at Welnowiec. Next, please. And along with those examples, some lovely track work in places. Not everything has been doubled. There is still quite a bit of single track to be found, including this delightfully tortuous section coming down towards a junction. Every tramway should have one of these. It's called Świętochłowice Gasworks. Everyone should have a gasworks junction, and it's coming down to it. Next, please. And here's a fine example of a building which has stood the test of time. Up there on the roof line is the building date of 1898, 1 year before the electric trams first came to this location, which is at what's now known as Horsov Batory. Next, please. And there's a view from those dates from about 1905, actually. The building there on the left, definitely recognizable, and 2 cars of the Schlesische Kleinbahnen crossing at Bismarckhütte. Next, please. Here's a really funny quote. Remember, I showed a photograph of the points being cleared out at a crossover in Zabrze, and here it is in use, and the trams could not get on the stop without straddling both lines. Next, please. And there used to be a situation on a Saturday afternoon when the double set operating on Route 7 was changed for a single car. And because of the track layout, everybody had to get off 100 yards or so back down the road and walk forward. And then the single car would come out of the depot on the wrong line, and all the passengers would have to march over the proper track to get on here. Next, please. Here's another view of the crossover there being used. When Horsov Batory depot is used as a short working point, which it is frequently, then this is a situation that will arise. Next, please. A view from the railway, the electric railway from Katowice to Gliwice, and 2 trams on 2 lines going in the same direction. There is a very interesting piece of track layout just here at Chopinitsa, and the number 9 is coming round onto its single track. Next, please. I see everybody's packing up, but we're almost finished. I want to show you this view of All Saints' Day in 2005, when at that time the company ran a tandem pair of N-class cars on the 38 in Beton to cater for the cemetery traffic. Next, please. And here's one of the Frankfurt articulated cars in the tram station at Beton on a temporary route 59 going to Gliwice depot. Next, please. When single line operation is running, temporary signal lights are erected. Here's a motorman getting out onto some hard standing in order to set the signals. Next, please. And here is a pair of signals. There's only one double pair now left on the system. Most of these have been phased out, but not everywhere. And they're operated by key. And the tramway says that they are actually their most reliable form of signals. Next, please. Right. This is an unusual view. One of the Vienna cars on line 1 in Katowice, which was the longest route on the network. When the track had been rebuilt, two sections were joined together and it was possible to go through from Katowice all the way to Gliwice, but it became unreliable apparently, and after 18 months the service was split again. Next, please. This is the first day of operation of line 2 in 2019, I think it was, with one of the Frankfurt cars taking one of the pair of new curves laid in at the junction in Zabrze. Next, please. And a very rare occurrence is the operation of a long working. And for a short while, 1 car an hour on line 4 was extended beyond Ullumpi to Rue de Clary. And even though this car has got these horrible LED destination indicators, you should just be able to make out that that's what it says, Rue de Schwanska Clary. Next, please. This is in Świętochłowice, which was an early example of environmental improvements. This was done in 2004. Next, please. And a remarkable situation, as you could see, with everybody marching out into the road at Guido Pit. This still happens today, and it's the main road between Poland and Czechoslovakia. Next, please. This is on the rural section of line 14, which is currently under reconstruction, where the tramway is laid on a single line alongside the railway embankment. Next, please. And the next shot is a real country tramway with the single car nosing its way around the corner on something approaching a country lane on its way to Mysłowice. Next, please. This is at Benzine with the castle in the background. There's been a castle here since the 13th century, but it's been knocked about a bit since, very substantially actually. And this one apparently dates from 1856. Next, please. And a monument to the former industrial metropolis at Katowice at what is now Silesia City Shopping Mall. Next, please. Quite a nicely lit and designed tram station in the centre of Katowice. Next, please. And that, just to refresh your memory, is what the network looks now, and how hopefully it will develop further in the future under the supervision of ZTM. Next, please. So latest developments. Here is an extension of Route 15 at Zagorze. Next, please. Relayed track on the crosstown route in Zabrze, the old Hindenburg Corporation line, crossing a watercourse at Likučice. Next, please. This is in Bisłowice, the single track layout before it was doubled. That's not long ago. Next, please. Again in Bisłowice, nice old town, I think, quite attractive, and with single track tramway running in the gutter. Next, please. This is a scene you won't see now. A terrible example where the track is right up against the curb in Nivka, and the intending passengers all have to stand out there amongst the traffic waiting to get on. Highly dangerous. It must be awful on a wet night in the winter, but fortunately that's all been changed. Next, please. And single track, one of my favorite curves in Hropachov on the little line 17 between Łagiewnicki and Lipiny. The single track, unchanged for 123 years. Next, please. In a moment, you'll see it doubled. And further down the route, in the section that is going to remain single track, again with some, I'm afraid, rather poor quality housing that has survived. Next, please. And this is at the junction at Lipiny. This has all been relayed now as double track, but in those days, the number 17 would wait here at the edge of its track, looking out for the number 11 to come through, and then would follow in behind it, and they would work down in tandem on the section between there and Hebsi. Again, that has all now been doubled. Next, please. The number 38 with the old layout at the northern terminus in Bytom, with the buildings in the background on the site of the old Bytom municipal tram depot. Next, please. And at Sąbieki Mill, again, another of the border points in interwar days, where passengers had to change cars, change of gauge here, which lasted until 1946. Next, please. And that's Sąbieki Mill today. Double track loop and a modern articulated car. Next, please. And that is something that the company has been unable to eliminate, all the big crowd crossing the road in Godula on line 9. So it's still got its quirky points as this route. Next, please. But hopefully with a forethought for the future, you'll see here that a trough has been laid ready to accept a second track, should it be possible to double this section of line 9. Next, please. And there we are, coming into Novi Bytom by the side of the old steelworks. Next, please. And there it is, it's the last place on the network where you can still obtain a classic view of old industrial archaeology with the trams. The blast furnace itself has not been at work since 1988. It's still there, and the firm still exists, but it supplies preformed steel on a commercial basis. Next, please. And just to say that the company is not averse to putting out one of its works cars, which this is. It's the breakdown car on a special service if there's nothing else available. This was put out for one day to mark the company's 125th centenary anniversary. Next, please. Going through a rebuilt shopping mall in Sosnowiec. Next, please. And a highlight of the rebuilding, the track rebuilding program, is at Hebsi, which was an absolutely dreadful interchange before, a shocking monument to communist planning and lack of thought for passengers. But it was really rebuilt very nicely and in double quick time about 18 months ago. Next, please. A new route for which a new bridge had to be built over this urban motorway in Katowice. First new route in Katowice since 1947. Next, please. And a new curve, reinstating one removed in 1971 to enable the 938 in Bytom to run its extended route into the town centre. And very popular it appears to be too, the extension. The building is Bytom Prison, dating from 1861. A real piece of Prussian architecture there. Next, please. And at the junction in Bytom, with both cars on the 38 passing at this point, the old car and the model trans car on the right. Next, please. And at Bytom terminus, which is now being doubled, so that both cars on route can be there together, though generally it's only for a few seconds. Next, please. And here's a lovely piece of new double track replacing single line, and it's also put in a new stop, which is much appreciated, I think, by the residents. This is up at Łagiewnicki on one of my favourite lines, the 17, down to Lipini. Next, please. And there is that curve at Hropachov on the 17, now doubled. It takes on a wholly different appearance. Next, please. Emergency track works this year at Żarbrze brought out 4 of the unrebuilt Frankfurt articulated cars because there was a need for double-ended rolling stock just for one day. I happened to be tipped off whilst I was in Bytom and hot-footed it down to Żarbrze to make sure I captured it. Next, please. I think this has gone now. This was taken this April with a tram coming under the railway bridge at Sopinica. The bridge dating from narrow gauge days was opened in 1900, but I think that has gone. Next, please. And double track now in Mysłowice. Gone as the single track. Next, please. And the glory that was Mysłowice. A poor headstock, desolate now, chimney, old industrial buildings, and new temporary Route 34. That was taken again in April of this year. Next, please. And that, ladies and gentlemen, those of you who've lasted the course, is the end of my presentation to you on Tramway Śląskie.